Okay. Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Duran, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering the solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we have discontinued our in-person events, and without our previous revenue generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our local staff. You can donate at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program is on energy reform in Mexico and the U.S. pushback to that. If the greenwashing rhetoric of the international media and corporate PR machines is to be believed, AMLO is a lover of dirty energy, a 70s throwback, coal and oil addict who is thrusting Mexico irresponsibly into a fossil fuel future. In truth, what he is trying to do is reclaim Mexico's sovereignty over its own energy resources, the original sin of any country from the imperial perspective. In doing so, he is taking on multinational energy monoliths and governments of Spain, the US, and Canada, the latter two of which are threatening to attempt to block the president's reforms through the arbitration mechanisms of NAFTA 2. Kurt Hackbarth will review AMLO's reforms, which attempt to walk back elements of the 2013 energy privatization of Enrique Peña Nieto and give some indications of where Mexico is leading in energy terms. Kurt Hackbarth is a native of the US but has now taken on Mexican citizenship. He writes for Jacobin magazine on Mexico and Latin America, and has also published in The Nation, Global, Animal, Political, and Tierra Adentro. He's appeared on programs such as Julio Astillero and with John Ackerman. I want to welcome Kurt to today's discussion. After his presentation, of course, the floor will be open for your questions and comments. Okay, Kurt, take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Cliff. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today, and a pleasure to talk about a very important topic that has been, in my point of view, significantly manipulated, not surprisingly, by the international media. So I'm happy to set some of the records straight with what's going on in Mexico in terms of energy. So I'm going to talk for maybe about a half hour. Cliff said that's about kind of the standard there, and then we can open it up for questions, comments, and get into kind of more of a dialogue. So I just want to start with a little bit of historical perspective, and then we can go into what's been going on over the last couple of years. I think we should remember, just as a kind of a starting point, that energy is the big topic in geopolitics. Energy is the thing, right? Where you get your energy, how much control a nation has over its own energy, and in terms of colonialism or neocolonialism, the control that other countries have over your energy resources. That is, from the Middle East to Asia to Latin America, energy is the mother of all topics in geopolitics, and it's only going to get more so in coming years, with Ukraine, with a series of other issues that have heightened that issue even further. Now, as we know, Mexico and all of Latin America suffered through several hundred years of colonization, where Spain was the country that pillaged and dominated energy resources. That situation persisted into the first century of Mexico's independence in 1821, with private industries, private companies continuing to dominate Mexico's energy resources. Pushback in this began in the 20th century. Certainly before, but markedly in the 20th century. So you have the famous miners' strike in Cananea in 1906, which I wrote about in my most recent article in Jacobin. And that really set the stage for the Mexican Revolution in 1910, which then led to what at the time was the most progressive constitution in the world, the Mexican Constitution of 1917. It was again a labor movement in the 30s in the oil industry that provoked the nationalization of oil in 1938 in the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas. Foreign oil companies refused to adhere to a Supreme Court ruling in favor of workers' rights. And that pushed Lázaro Cárdenas, who had been trying to kind of negotiate and play kind of an intermediary role, that pushed him into what's known in Mexico as the gesta. And the gesta is the great gesture of nationalization in 1938, which is still commemorated every year in Mexico. It's a very important date in Mexico. This was followed in 1960 by the nationalization of the electricity sector in the presidency of López Mateos, right, with his famous quote that anyone who cedes energy resources to foreign powers is a traitor to the nation. And that's actually a quote that AMLO has taken up back again in recent times, in the context of his fight. I'm jumping a little bit for questions of time. It's obviously, we could talk about the history of Pemex, the oil industry and the electricity sector and the Federal Electricity Commission and Luz y Fuerza del Centro. There's a lot we could talk about with regards to energy, but for questions of time, I'm going to fast forward a little bit to the 2000s, where you had a series of attempts to try to crack open Mexico's energy sector. This began even earlier in the 90s with President Carlos Salinas de Gortari, who began step by step opening the sector. For example, allowing what was known as self-supply in the energy sector, which sounds good, right? You know, small producers being able to produce energy for themselves. But we'll see in a minute how that became perverted by large multinational companies. In the 2000s, then, the fraudulent president, Felipe Calderón, tried to crack open Pemex and failed. It was beaten back by a popular movement led by the then opposition leader López Obrador in the late 2000s. Finally, in 2013 and 2014, Enrique Peña Nieto from the PRI passed a series of constitutional reforms, very controversial. People were out in the streets. They tried to close down Congress. Congress had to have its sessions in another building. This is right at the time that AMLO had a heart attack, so that curbed his ability to participate in what was going on. And the reforms did pass. And they opened up, Pemex had already been opened up in a lot of ways to private interests, but what it did was legalize those changes and raise them to the constitutional level. So what you had, that was the time when foreign gas stations started to operate in Mexico. Before it was all Pemex gas stations. They liberated, right? That's quite a loaded term. Liberated gasoline prices before gasoline prices were set by the government, and all the franchise owners of Pemex had to use that same price for gasoline. But the largest changes had to do with drilling rights. And the Peña Nieto reforms, they auctioned off large swaths of land in offshore areas for foreign drilling rights. Now, a lot of those weren't used. Foreign companies basically bought those rights and then would use them for speculation and for, different kinds of financial games. At the same time, the Federal Electricity Commission, separately, had been opened up to allow for foreign companies to enter into Mexico's electricity market. And the Electricity Commission was forced to buy their energy first. There was a series of auctions of energy. And through these auction mechanisms, which are easily manipulable, basically the Federal Electricity Commission was left as kind of a public entity forced to buy private electricity, while at the same time they were subsidizing private companies which were using their infrastructure, the infrastructure that had been built up over 100 years in the country, all the transmission lines, all of the wires, all of the cables. So foreign companies were making a mint. And then going back to what I was talking about with regards to the self-supply, they would set up these kind of schemes where a company like Iberdrola, the Spanish multinational, or Enel, the Italian energy company, would say, all right, we're self-suppliers. We're going to produce our own energy, and we're going to share it with our partners. So a lot of foreign companies like Walmart, Mitsubishi, all kinds of foreign multinationals would sign up for a peso, 5 pesos, and become partners of these international energy companies, who would then, using the public grid, would distribute the energy they produced to their partners across the country. So for example, projects like the big wind project in Oaxaca, which received a lot of foreign press as a great ecological project, they were paying the owners of those lands a pittance, a fourth of what they pay for property owners in Europe. And that energy was not going to those pueblos in Oaxaca where the energy was being produced. That energy was going to Walmart. That energy was going to Coca-Cola. That energy was going to FEMSA, the owners of the OXXO convenience stores. So it was a scam on the system in every respect. First, because the Federal Electricity Commission was forced to buy private energy first, which means that their own public energy consumption had to lie idle. The Federal Electricity Commission has a large number of hydroelectric plants in the east and southeast of the country, many of which were lying idle while the Federal Electricity Commission was forced to buy private energy. So what we saw in 2019 with those series of torrential rains that happened is those dams, those presas overflowed, and they had to open the dams to avoid worse flooding of Villahermosa and the Tabasco area, and it flooded a number of pueblos in that area. So there are real physical effects to a situation where public energy lies idle and private energy is subsidized and first in the chain. Meanwhile, with regards to Pemex, the oil company, the state oil company, there was a process known as huachicoleros or huachicol. And the huachicoleros was basically the stealing of oil along the ducts. And that was a situation which had people on the inside and people on the outside. Mexico was losing billions in this. So actually one of AMLO's first actions when he became president in December of 2018 was to attack these gas thieves, gasoline thieves, right? The oil thieves, known as the huachicoleros. So in all of these terms, you could see that Mexico's energy sector was being bled dry, literally, with these ducts. Also the fact that Mexico had not increased its refining capacity. It had let its refining capacity decline. Mexico has only, I think, 6 oil refineries. They hadn't built a new one since the late 70s. They're just building one now in Dos Bocas, and they bought one in Deer Park in Houston under AMLO. So what that meant was that Mexico was producing oil, but had to send it to the US to be refined and then buy it back, right? Which was the metaphor that AMLO used a lot, that it's like selling oranges and buying back orange juice. The same thing was happening with natural gas. Mexico has a large amount of natural gas, but it was buying natural gas from Texas with the argument that it was cheaper. Well, we saw with the crisis of what's going on now that international energy prices can fluctuate a lot. It may have been cheaper then, but then we see that things can change on a dime if the international situation changes a lot. So Mexico had led to a situation where there was an incredible amount of energy dependence on the United States. Mexico was exporting its oil to the United States and buying back gasoline. It was buying natural gas from the United States while it was burning off its own gas. That's the perverse element of this. Mexico is literally burning off 10 to 20% of its own gas into the air. While at the same time, it was buying American gas. On the Felipe Calderon administration, Mexico made a deal with Repsol, the Spanish giant, to buy natural gas from Peru through Repsol, which makes no sense at all because Spain doesn't even have natural gas. This is the degree of the extent to which Mexico was prostrate in energy terms. Pemex under Calderon also bought, I think, 10% of Repsol's stock. The stock went down. Mexico lost a mint. And then when Calderon left office, he joined the board of directors of a Repsol subsidiary. So this is the classic revolving door, right? They open up Mexico to private energy interests in mind-boggling ways. I mean, imagine a country like Mexico that has its own natural gas, buying natural gas from a Spanish company, Spain not having natural gas. So Spain gets the natural gas from Peru and then sends it to Mexico through them. These are the kind of bizarre schemes that were happening this entire time. In both gas terms, in both electricity terms, and as we talked about with regards to oil and Pemex. So when AMLO took office, Pemex was in a terrible shape financially. The Federal Electricity Commission was in terrible shape financially. And 40% of electricity generation in Mexico was in foreign hands. So the problem with that is when the lights go out in Texas, as they did a couple of years ago, when people were, had icicles in their taps, right? Because they couldn't heat their homes and there were no lights on for weeks. Ted Cruz flies off to Cancun. That had a knock-on effect in Mexico because a lot of the northern part of Mexico was connected to that grid. So it gives the lie to this neoliberal argument that globalization is always the most efficient way to provide goods and services. Because it's supposedly cheaper, it's supposedly more efficient. Well, when Mexico goes out into blackout because Texas went into blackout, it gives the lie to this, right? Also, through the Peña Nieto years, as oil and gasoline were being liberated, gasoline prices were going up through a series of what's known as gasolinazos or gasoline taxes, which they just go up week by week by week by week by week, right? So now Mexico pays 22 to 23 pesos a gallon, a liter for gasoline, which is the equivalent of, what would that be? Around $4 a gallon for gasoline, with much lower salaries. And this is, when I first moved here, it was 6 pesos a liter. I mean, it's gone up over this time about 4 times. The big Peña Nieto promise was that through this liberation, of course, of prices and whatever else, competition, blah, 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 gas and electricity prices would go down. And of course they didn't, they went up, way up. Now, what has AMLO done? And what hasn't he done? Energy has always been a central theme for López Obrador because one of his central themes is national sovereignty. And he makes the argument very clearly that you can't have national sovereignty if you don't have control over your own energy. You simply can't. How can you have, an independent foreign policy from a country like the United States if the United States controls the gasoline that you get, right? When AMLO took office, I think Mexico had 4 or 5 days worth of gasoline reserves on hand. So if the United States had decided to turn off the refineries, Mexico would have run out of gasoline in a week. That's the situation Mexico had gotten to. You simply can't have an independent country or foreign policy if you're that dependent on energy to another country. And that's all the more ludicrous because Mexico has a lot of energy. It has gasoline, it has oil, it has natural gas, it has wind, it has all sorts of mineral wealth, despite hundreds of years of colonization, it still has a lot of energy resources. So it's, and we're not talking about like a situation like Japan, which doesn't have enough energy resources. It has to work things out on the international. Mexico has its own resources, but it was allowing itself to be bled dry. So AMLO first tried to get control over the energy sector through a series of executive orders with the Federal Electricity Commission. Basically saying the Federal Electricity Commission has to depend more on public energy, public sources of energy first. Those were batted back by the courts. The courts are stacked with conservative justices in Mexico because there's never, there hasn't been not even a center-left government in Mexico before AMLO, arguably since the 30s. So the courts are all, very right-wing. So they batted back his executive orders. So then AMLO attempted to pass a law, the energy sector law, which again went to the courts. So it's funny that, a lot of foreign commentators, from the corporate media say, oh, AMLO is a dictator, he's authoritarian, he's messianic. Actually, AMLO has tried to do the use the minimal tools to make these changes. And every time they've been batted back, he just ups the ante, which is actually an interesting political tactic, right? Kind of the opposite of what the US Democrats do, right? The US Democrats get a little pushback and they give up. So AMLO, tried the executive order, then went to a law, that went to the courts, and they said, all right, we're going to do a constitutional reform. Now, the constitutional reform, just like the United States, requires a supermajority to pass, and he didn't get the supermajority, but he really showed up the opposition. So it was a political victory, even though it wasn't a legislative victory on the constitutional level. He didn't get his amendment. But, AMLO could point to history and saying, we're in the tradition of Lázaro Cárdenas. We're trying to get back public sovereignty over oil, over our electricity, over and against foreign companies like Iberdrola and Enel, which right now are contributing to the energy crisis in Europe, as we see, right? The European Union has the same kinds of energy auctions. It has the same kind of enforced privatization of energy from the European Union. And so you see, Spaniards suffering from tremendous energy bills, right from Iberdrola, right? Iberdrola sends the bills to people. You see in Great Britain, people suffering from tremendous energy bills through their privatized energy companies, right? And then, you're in winter's coming on now in Europe, and people are really scared about what's going to happen. Basically, that same European model of privatized energy, very easily rigged energy auctions is what they wanted to impose in Mexico. And they have done it in a large part of the world. I mean, energy has been liberated in a majority of countries, in a majority of countries in the world. The advantage of Mexico is it's got a very long political tradition behind it of energy being a sovereignty issue. And that resonates very much with people here. Because of Cárdenas, because of López Mateos, because of the history of the revolution and Tierra en Libertad and a lot of things. So that helped AMLO because he was able to paint the opposition as being, and he said they're traitors. I mean, he didn't beat around the bush in this. So you'd see, opposition politicians that have you'd see this in public squares in Mexico, their pictures and traitors to the nation and, rhetoric that may seem overblown in other countries. And Mexico is very much part of, because López Mateos said it himself, Cárdenas himself said it. If you give energy to foreign interests, you're a traitor to the nation. And we saw what had happened, right? People were very upset about the situation with Peña Nieto and his energy counter reforms. That's part of what sent Peña Nieto's presidency into a tailspin, together with Ayotzinapa, the students at the normal school, and other things. But this idea of giving away Mexico's energy sovereignty to foreigners was a huge issue here. So on the day of the vote for the constitutional reform, it didn't pass. It got a simple majority. It didn't get a constitutional majority. The very next day, they sessioned again and they nationalized lithium. The next day, which was an interesting kind of a 1-2 political strategy of, all right, we'll take the hit on losing the constitutional amendment, but we win the political victory. The next day they came back and they passed the nationalization of lithium. So that's another piece of the puzzle here, that Mexico has some of the largest lithium stores in the world, in Sonora specifically in the north, but also in many other states in the country. And lithium is important for batteries, for cell phones, computers, It even has pharmaceutical uses. Lithium is, is going to be the oil of the 21st century. And there were, AMLO had sent out some signs, some feints that maybe they weren't going to do a full nationalization on that, maybe just to try to kind of throw people off. But they did. They nationalized lithium completely. And they're in the process now of setting up a state agency to administer Mexico's lithium. And they're in talks with Bolivia. They're in talks with Argentina, other Latin American countries that have lithium, to try to set up international cooperation on batteries, on electric cars, and try to get some international cooperation on that, to do it in a Latin American scale, which is promising, and I think, and I hope that goes forward. Anyway, after the constitutional amendment failed, the Supreme Court of Mexico ruled that AMLO's law, the law, not the constitutional amendment, but the law, was ruled constitutional. Fortunately, Mexico Supreme Court requires a 2/3 majority to overrule laws, right? Which I think is something we should consider as well. You can't just use a simple majority to overrule laws. You have to have a 2/3 majority. So AMLO's law went into effect. And what the law basically says is that the Federal Electricity Commission has to use public sources of energy first in its stream of energy. So that means the hydroelectric plants in the south and southeast. That means public-owned sources of energy first, and then whatever is needed can then come from private sources of energy. Now, private companies, as you can imagine, have set up a hue and cry in this. They've got a lot of money for public relations experts, and they've obviously got a lot of connections with the international press. So the idea has been to paint AMLO as a fossil fuel lover. They even tried to psychoanalyze him in The Guardian, that AMLO grew up in Tabasco, so he's got an emotional attachment to oil. Stuff like this, psychobabble, right? They know AMLO because they knew where he grew up. AMLO's a throwback to the 70s. They opened one coal plant back up in Mexico, and The Guardian, oh, AMLO, coal. What they don't tell you in The Guardian is that Mexico, 7% of Mexico's energy comes from coal, 7% or so. In Germany, the mecca of green energy, it's 20 some odd percent, and rising now because Germany is reopening its coal plants because of the Ukraine crisis and because they decided to close their nuclear, right? So Germany is much, much, much more dependent on coal than Mexico is. Mexico really doesn't use that much coal, right? But that doesn't stop this whole, what is known as greenwashing of international energy corporations trying to paint themselves, the same people who've caused the problem, trying to paint themselves as the green saviors now, because they had wind farms in Mexico, or because they have solar projects and such. As I talked about, a lot of those projects were being used to funnel energy to corporate donors, who were then paying much less for energy than domestic users, the rest of us here in Mexico, because they were part of the self-supply scam. So they were getting subsidies, effectively subsidies from the federal government. So, the OXXO down the street was paying a much lower rate for energy, comparatively. So they'd have their, refrigerators and freezers on all the night and whatever else, because it was a green energy setup. It's a really very clever scam. And you've seen this from Iberdrola, you've seen this from Enel. When the energy reforms were being debated, there was a lobbyist from Enel right on the floor of the Mexican Congress, this Pablo Salerno, no? He was sitting with the deputies from the PAN party, basically lobbying them in their seats in Congress. So that's been a big issue here, this attempt from New York Times, Washington Post, the regular culprits, to try to paint AMLO as a dirty energy lover and a throwback to the 70s. Right? and somebody who's disdaining the bounties of green energy provided by multinationals. Now, AMLO is not against green energy. One of the biggest, one of the big government projects right now is a massive solar farm in Sonora, right? Has AMLO done everything he could on green energy? No. And I think that's something the government needs to be critiqued for. But Rocio Nale, the energy secretary, has said that Mexico is on course to have 35% of its energy produced by renewables by 2024, which is the international goal, and that includes hydroelectric. And they're on path to do that. That's on the way. And I think we have to keep this in perspective that Mexico produces, I think, 1% of greenhouse gas emissions. The United States and China produce 45%, just those two countries, right? The industrialized world has produced far and away over history the absolute vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions and continues to do so. As we Americans know, even the most recent climate bill by the Biden administration includes provisions to open up more gas and oil for drilling, right? That was the Manchin thing that he got in there. And the Biden administration has been, they wanted to open up a massive amount of the Gulf of Mexico for drilling, which has been put on hold in the courts. And I don't know what the story is on that. They've opened up public lands for drilling. So it's just this massive hypocrisy that you see the US ambassador down here, Ken Salazar with his 10-gallon Texan hat. Salazar, who was Secretary of the Interior, was terrible on environmental and energy things, He was giving new leases in the Gulf of Mexico right after the Deepwater disaster in 2010. Running around saying that, we need more green energy in Mexico. I mean, it's just nauseating. Anyway, so just to conclude, because I've gone on a little over the half hour, and then whatever questions you have. The United States and Canada have opened up a period of consultations with regards to AMLO's energy law in the framework of the USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, with the basic argument that the laws that benefit the Federal Electricity Commission are unfair, provide an unfair advantage to foreign companies, right? Now, this is a very dangerous argument to make, because if you follow that argument to its logical conclusion, the public sector then could never do anything, could never then intervene in any market, because then that would be unfair advantage to any private company at all. So basically, the extension of that argument is that would neuter the public sector in all respects. What they basically want is they want the public sector to do the dirty work. They want the public sector to lay the lines, do the cables, just like the Federal Electricity Commission in Mexico. Mexico geographically is a very challenging country. It's very mountainous. There are a lot of remote pueblos. So the titanic labor of the Federal Electricity Commission in Mexico over the 20th century, kind of like the TVA in the US, was to bring electricity to these very remote mountainous pueblos in Mexico, which are sometimes hours walking from the closest road. And all of Mexico became electrified, just about. So what they want is that. They want the government to do the dirty work, to bring all the infrastructure, the entire country. But then the moment that the federal government wants to use that infrastructure, oh no, that's unfair restraint of trade. Oh no. You do the dirty work, but then we want to come in and use that infrastructure and plug into it for profit. And then use a green ecological argument to cover ourselves in the foreign press. That's the gig. So, what was I saying there? Yeah. So the USMCA, they're in consultations now, and the threat is to then go to an arbitration panel in the USMCA. And it would be 2 against 1. It would be Canada and the US against Mexico on that. AMLO has been quite strident on this. He even in one day in his press conference played a Chico Che song, who's a Mexican singer, saying, "Oh, I'm so scared." He actually played the song in his press conference, right? And recently said that the United States had backed off its threat to go to the U.S. the USMCA panel. Well, then the U.S. trade rep came out and said, "No, we haven't. It could still go to a panel," but that's kind of cooled off a little bit. They haven't pulled the trigger on going to a panel as of yet. They're still in a kind of that cooling off period. But there's been this inflated rhetoric from Democrats and Republicans alike on this. Ted Cruz and Rubio, but also, Democratic, Congress people from Texas haven't been any better on this. Bob Menendez from New Jersey has been awful on this. So it's a very bipartisan line of argument from the United States against Mexico and AMLO with the press on their side. So all this by way of saying that we'll see what happens if this actually goes to a dispute panel or not. Remember that the USMCA was negotiated by the Peña Nieto government in its outgoing months, but President-elect AMLO got a clause in there, got a whole section in there saying that Mexico's energy industry is exempt from this. Mexico has absolute sovereignty over its own energy. It was actually quite clear, if you read it. Most times trade agreements are very obtuse in their language. This was actually very, very clear. But, there have been other things that have been equally clear that have been overturned by courts or arbitration panels or, whatnot. So that's where we are now. The energy reform law is in effect, and it's actually been quite gratifying from my point of view to see Iberdrola, for example, when their contracts have run out for a number of plants, they haven't renewed the contract. And so the Federal Electricity Commission has taken over those Iberdrola plants again. They just shut down an Iberdrola wind project in Guanajuato a couple months ago because they didn't have the right permit. They were using the permit for another project for the Guanajuato wind farm. And they said, this is what happened in previous administrations. Private companies could do what they wanted, not have the right permit, not have the right paperwork, didn't matter. So now the Electricity Regulatory Commission is cracking down on these things. And Iberdrola is actually in financial problems, and he's even talked about pulling out of Mexico completely because it's not, they don't get the full run of the house like they used to. So we'll see where they are. I've talked a lot. So you might have questions or you might have comments. That's kind of where we are at the moment. AMLO's reforms have not fully repealed Peña Nieto's reforms. It hasn't. But it's made some inroads, and we have to keep into account the fact that he's got a lot of very strong powers against him. Foreign governments, the foreign press, and multinational energy companies, which have unlimited amounts of money for lobbying and perverting the course of justice and lawfare and all these things. So I think he's done some pretty good things. Of course, we'd like him to do more, but he's been pretty good on this, I think, all told, from my point of view anyway. But that's my intro, and then whatever else you might want to talk about. The floor is open.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. Those who are watching us on YouTube will have to send your question or comment to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I'll pass your words on to those in the Zoom room. But those who are here in the Zoom room can raise your questions directly yourself. So if you have a question or comment, raise your hand. Okay, Larry Harris.
Kurt, I understand, and it is very visible, the U.S. position and the extent to which they are self-interested in the positions they take. But what about the Canadians? The The Canadians can't have nearly as much interest in the Mexican energy sector. So why would they side with the US in this issue?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, Canada has got a lot of interests in Mexico as well. First and foremost, in the mining sector. Canadian companies dominate the Mexican mining sector. I think 60 to 70% of Mexican mines are in the hands of Canadian companies. And then the US is second. And then, Mexico owning its own mines is just a third. So I think Canada has, and there've been a lot of, huge problems with labor, environmental, with regards to here in Oaxaca as well, with Canadian-owned mines. So I think the worry from the Canadian point of view is that it would create a precedent for future governments to do what they're doing to mining, what they've done in the energy sector, which is take back public control, regulate, if not nationalize, regulate more stiffly, with the same argument, that Mexico's mineral wealth is property of the nation, right? And that's even in the Constitution. Unlike the United States, where if you strike oil on your property, it's yours. In Mexico, anything that's under the ground is public, right? Mm-hmm. It includes minerals, that includes, oil, that includes anything, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why, Canada has an oar in this fight, right? I think there's a philosophical thing there, right? And the Trudeau government, in Canada, the Liberals there, I think they philosophically would side more with the U.S. argument on this than Mexico's, with AMLO's idea of public sovereignty over energy, right? So I think there's philosophical affinity there, and I think there's also the concern from Canada's point of view that if this goes through, then other things could go through in the future. And actually, activists in Mexico have criticized AMLO for not going hard enough against mining interests in Mexico over his term. He hasn't given any new mining concessions or licenses, but he hasn't also rolled back any mining concessions or licenses over his term. So he's basically left his hands off them. I think, he's chosen his battles. You can do what you can in 6 years, except for lithium. Mm-hmm. Very, categorical on that. But that would be my answer to that. I think a philosophical affinity with the US and worries that this could then carry over into the mining sector, where Canada has very significant and direct interest in Mexico.
Thank you.
Metsu Louis has her hand up.
Hi, Kurt. Thank you. I think you've said that lithium is the new gold. I think I'm quoting you on that. So I'm just wondering, in some ways, time is on Mexico's side in that lithium is going to continue to rise in importance, and hopefully oil and gas will get reduced in importance. In terms of negotiating with the United States, can AMLO use kind of the lithium card as a bargaining chip?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think yes. The answer is yes. When Bolivia had its coup d'etat a few years ago, right, 2019, the Elon Musk quote at the time is, "We can coup whoever we want," right? That's what he said in Twitter. So it was quite clear that the coup in Bolivia had to do with interest in lithium. Right? And that's only going to increase over time, as you say, the market for electric cars and solar panels and all of that. So yes, I think time is on Mexico's side on that. I would agree, right? But I think for the time being, the Ukraine crisis has continued to put the emphasis on fossil fuels, and that actually also has its own advantages for Mexico. Just a month or so ago, the president of Germany, you're trying to negotiate a deal with Mexico to get more of Mexico's natural gas into Europe, right? Because they need, Europe is now desperately in need of energy resources, right? The U.S. has been negotiating with Venezuela now, right? Unthinkable to get their out of Venezuela's oil again, right? Maduro went over to the COP27 and shook hands with John Kerry and shook hands with Macron, all right? So this puts Mexico in particular, and Latin America in general, in a much stronger position, in theory, if they handle this well, right? If they handle this well. Previous Mexican governments have been very subservient to the United States and Europe in energy industries. AMLO has said with Germany that they want to get, put up liquefied natural gas plants and, and start, exporting what they had been just burning off before, right? But yes, we all hope very much that, that lithium and greener energy become, an important part of the picture very quickly, right? But it's important that happen, on Mexico's terms and not because of, a corporate greenwashing, propaganda effort. I think another thing that should be mentioned is, international campaigns to require the global north to pay the global south for these things. The global north industrialized on the backs of fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution, right? So I think any kind of international justice would have to go through having the global north pay the global south, because the global north benefited from this and produced 99% of the emissions right now that are in the atmosphere. So that's something that didn't come up at COP27 with its, Coca-Cola being amongst the sponsors there. But I think that should be a part of the equation. But yes, I think lithium was a strategic move. AMLO saw what had happened in Bolivia, wanted to make a very strong statement on that. And I think that's also in the context too of AMLO's pushing for greater Latin American political cooperation, right? He's been very critical of the Organization of American States, headed by Luis Almagro. He's attempted to strengthen the CELAC, which is the Organization of Caribbean and Latin American States. He's heading off to Peru in the next week or so, AMLO is, because the Peruvian Congress didn't allow the Peruvian president to come up to Mexico for the Alliance of the Pacific. So he's going to Peru, right? So you see AMLO is taking on a leadership role politically in Latin America to try to coordinate some of these things on a regional basis. And I think something like lithium would require a regional cooperation. Otherwise, you open yourselves up to, was coups or other things, as we've seen.
Yeah, Mark Ginsburg.
Sure, thank you for a really incredible presentation. Why is lithium not on the table by the U.S. and the media, or maybe it is, and I'm just not aware of it? It seems that act would also get reactions and be threatened to go to arbitration, or that's not the word you used, with the NAFTA type mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak a little bit about how that has played out?
Yeah, the US and Canada haven't yet made a fuss about the lithium issue. Like they have been doing with the energy and the electricity reforms. I don't know if they're just doing one thing first. I think one factor here is that in electricity, they already had their foot in the door, right? Foreign companies had their foot in the door and they had a lot of their investments there, right? And mining, they have, they already have the control of mines. Lithium hasn't hardly been touched in Mexico yet. It hasn't hardly been touched. So multinational companies don't yet have their investments and don't have, that's when they really start to howl. When they think that they're going to lose their investments and lose their, plants and, have their infrastructure regulated or nationalized. So the fortunate thing about lithium is they did it early. There are a few contracts for lithium, which were given out. There was, it was Bacanora Lithium. There was a Chinese company in there, right, UK. And AMLO has said they're going to review those contracts and, there's licenses that are not being used, revoke them. But lithium, and also lithium is, it's not easy to mine. And it's not like you just, dig a hole and get it out. Sometimes the lithium is in difficult places. It requires a degree of investment. It has to go through a whole chemical process there. I'm not an expert in that, but I think the big answer is that foreign companies haven't yet gotten their claws on it. So there isn't a huge lobby yet for, like there is, in electricity and such, where they're already here. They're already in control of things and they don't want to lose that control. That said, I don't doubt that they're going to try to do something with lithium. I don't doubt it. They don't leave a stone unturned. They're ruthless. I mentioned the Musk quote about Bolivia, and the price of lithium since Mexico nationalized already went up like this, right? So already Mexico is sitting on something that has a much greater value than it did just a couple of years ago, and that curve is going to keep going up like this with regards to lithium. It's just going to go up like this. So I can see in another 5 to 10 years, in Mexico sitting on something that has $1 trillion worth of value and more. But all of a sudden, this is going to become a geopolitical issue, in a very direct way. It hasn't yet. It's still pretty new. The mining hasn't started. Mexico is just in the process of setting up the public company, right? But I don't doubt that it will become an issue, and future administrations are going to have to be very, very clear on that, because Pemex started this way too. Pemex started out, in this aura of, Cardenas and, national pride. In the time of the 30s, people were coming out with chickens and what they had in their houses to try to pay off the debt with foreign multinationals, right? Buying bonds. It became a whole national affair in the 30s to pay off these companies to make sure that oil became fully Mexican. Let's recall that at the time, the foreign oil companies were even thinking about creating a separate country in Mexico where the oil production is. They wanted to, there were talks of kind of trying to carve off, like Roosevelt carved off Panama out of Colombia to build the canal. To do something like that, they wanted to create like oil land up there to, have more control over that oil wealth. Now, Sonora, the lithium is very close to the US border too. It's a geographic happenstance that these stores happen to be on the Mexican side rather than the US side. There probably is in the US too, I don't know. But Sonora is very close to the border. So it's, it could become a delicate thing going forward. And what you don't want is you don't want to set up a company, the National Lithium Company, and then see what happened to Pemex, right? Successive governments basically let Pemex become dilapidated. There was a huge tax burden on Pemex. I think 70% of Pemex's profits were being used for federal government revenues at one point. There was corruption in the unions. There's a whole, there was the theft of the huachicol along the ducts. They were letting Pemex go. They were just letting it go to create an excuse for privatization. And that's what you don't want to do with the lithium thing, because imagine what Mexico could do with that lithium wealth. This is what I've argued. Mexico should earmark the lithium wealth for very specific things, national health care, which AMLO is now trying to do, right? A huge education investment. Just there's so much need in Mexico that you should very specifically say this lithium wealth is going to do this, and then lock that in. And so if the US were to try to, pull some shit down the line, which I don't doubt they will, you could say, look, this is what the lithium wealth is doing. The lithium wealth has lifted this many people out of poverty. It's created a national health system. It's doing this, it's doing that, it's doing that. And make sure that what happened with lithium, what happened with Pemex doesn't happen, hopefully, with the lithium situation.
One of the issues here in San Miguel is that there is a Canadian company that wants to open a gold mine.
Right.
It's been vigorously opposed by the campesinos, but favored by the local political leadership. It's something, it's open mining that would devastate a very large area of land, consume huge amounts of water in an area that is where water is quite scarce, and would pollute the aquifer. Now, what is the power of the federal government to deal with a situation like that?
Yes, that's a good question. And this has been the story of mining up and down Mexico over the course of recent decades. Pollution, contamination, contamination of the aquifer, labor problems, exploitation, and even infiltration of the narco. It's funny that if you superimpose a map of where narco, then there's the worst narco problems in Mexico. A lot of it lines up with where there's these mining projects. Right? So mining has been a scourge in a lot of ways. Just out here in outside of Mexico, in Magdalena Cotlan, there's a Canadian company, and they had a tailings pond at their mine. The tailings pond overflowed, contaminated the water in a neighboring town where the animals go to drink, and very little has been done about it. And then it happened again. Up in the mountains in the Sierra Norte here, there have been instances where actually pueblos have won against mining interests. If they're indigenous communities, they have international treaties that back them up. And so some number of Zapotec communities in the Sierra Norte have won battles against mining companies and have gotten projects suspended. Capulalpan, for instance, up here in the Sierra Norte. The federal government, in theory, has got a lot of power that it's not using in that respect. The problem is a lot of these concessions have been locked in for longer periods of time, so they'd have to, create the legal justification for breaking contracts, and then the international media would howl and say Mexico doesn't respect contracts, Mexico doesn't respect private investments. AMLO's a dictator. A contract is a contract, all of this. So this is why AMLO has been talking about, in a lot of sectors, reviewing every single contract and seeing if the contracts were made on the basis of fraud, if they were made on the basis of bribery, if there are illegalities in the contract, in order to have the legal justification for suspending or revoking a contract. Because they're very clever, these companies. They lock in rights for a long period of time in order to try to make sure that future governments can't do anything with regards to them. So that on one hand, right, the Energy Department, the Secretary of Energy, but also the Environmental Secretariat, Semarnat, could intervene in cases of environmental damage and destruction. Also, the National Water Agency, CONAGUA, could intervene in the case of dilapidation of water resources. We saw that Monterrey, the city of Monterrey, went dry this year, ran out of water, right? Because companies are pumping too much water, and a lot of times they're pumping, more water than they have rights to. AMLO hasn't been as strident with the water issue because a lot of these concessions are owned by national companies rather than international companies. Now, that shouldn't make a difference, right? But AMLO has been easier, he's gone easier on national companies than he has on international. So the federal government can intervene from a number of different ways. It could intervene from the Secretary of Energy, from the Secretary of Economy, from the Semarnat, and from CONAGUA. And that's a pending issue, and that's a can of worms right there. Mining projects, and as you said, I mean, this is a gold project, and there are other. I think that project you're referring to is one of the biggest gold mining projects in the world. If we were talking about the same project, this is a massive project, right? And it's a really political hot potato. This idea of repatriating Mexican gold to other countries, or the profits from it, as if we're still in the colonial era. Not to mention, all of the other issues around that. Labor. There have been assassinations around it. Open pit mining devastates areas and communities, forests, water, you name it. So in theory, they've got a lot of cards to play. That has not been the top priority of this government. In part because what I said, you choose your battles over 6 years. But that is definitely a pending issue. That's absolutely a pending issue. I mean, the fact that AMLO hasn't issued more licenses or concessions is one thing, but a huge amount of the country was already licensed off for mining, right? So just with the basis of the licenses that exist alone, a lot more mines could be opened. It's a pending issue. It's a pending issue, absolutely.
I see that Bruce Hobson has joined us. Welcome. Do you have any question or comment you want to raise? I did want to share a concern that I have. AMLO seems to be facing quite a dilemma. On the one hand, he wants to protect Mexico's sovereignty, as you've pointed out, but also, favors restoring state control over energy. But on the other hand, he also wants to minimize Mexico's contribution to climate change. It is a real dilemma he's caught on the horns of, and like your reflections on that.
What contributions to climate change is he trying to reduce?
Well, the use of fossil fuels, the oil especially, It's a major factor contributing to climate change. Now, Mexico's, of course, not a major contributor to climate change, but every country needs to do what it can to minimize its contributions.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a fair point to say that AMLO could be doing more on the climate issue. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the Sonora solar project is a big one. In Mexico City right now, they're putting in a massive solar project on the roof of the Central de Abastos market, which apparently is going to be, I think, the largest urban solar installation in the world. So some projects are happening. That said, Mexico and other, what are called developing nations are in a dilemma, right? Because the so-called developed world developed on the backs of fossil fuels. And then they're telling countries like Mexico, well, then you can't, right? You can't do what we did because we created a mess. And now you have to be the ones that pay for it by, by cutting your fossil fuel production. And actually what AMLO has said too, and I think it's very clear, he doesn't want to over drill from Pemex either. I think he said he wanted to do 200,000 barrels a day or something like that. But he said, there's a limit on this. He said, just what we need, but not more, right? He's certainly aware of what's going on. But I think, remember too, I think all of us should reflect on this, the global South is not causing this crisis, Most Mexicans, use public transportation to go to work because they can't afford cars, so they get in colectivos. They don't have a huge amount of devices in their houses because, people tend to live more simply, right? So, Mexicans in their daily lives are doing what Americans should already be doing, which is use more public transportation, not use as much electricity, right? All of these things people in the global South have always done. So I think we always have to just be careful in the terms of the debate. Yes, Mexico should do more. Every country should contribute. You're absolutely right. But it's the rich in the world who are doing this. It's the wealthy. It's a very narrow strata of about 100 corporations and some very rich people who wing around the world in their private jets and their yachts who are causing this problem. And those people have to pay for it first. The global South as well. But I think the global South should be paid by the global North to cut down on their emissions by countries that have benefited historically already from fossil fuel development. I agree that the environmental discourse in Mexico it's not, you don't hear it talked about enough. None of the major parties talk about it enough. It's simply not part of the general discourse here as much as it should be. The federal government should be doing much more with regards to educating people on what could be happening because Mexico is in a very fragile state ecologically. Mexico is a very dry country. A large swath of the country already suffers from problems with water. Just another degree of warming, you could have parts of Mexico that would then be uninhabitable because the water would run out. And that would precipitate massive dislocation of people and migration. And, as we've seen in Central America, part of what's fueling these immigration waves from Central America is the result of climate change in countries like Guatemala Honduras, and the like. And that's not being talked about enough. I absolutely agree with that. Here in Oaxaca, and the dry season, which is now, the water runs out routinely, and people have to buy water from water trucks, the pipas. What happens if there then isn't water from the pipas? Right? All of this has to be discussed much more than is happening now. I totally agree on that score, and I hope I hope that happens.
Well, if there are no other questions or comments, oh, I see Mark Ginsburg wishes to speak again.
Kurt, I'm trying to wrap my head around this situation you described, where the Federal Electricity Commission, I think it's called, has been required up until recently to purchase private sources of power first. Could you talk a little bit more about the mechanism for that and how that came about, both in terms of legislation or executive order, but also what was the discourse that justified that? If it had to be justified, it wasn't just imposed, if you will.
Yeah. No, thanks for the question. It's complicated. This whole system with sourcing of energy is part of those Peña Nieto privatizations of 2013 and 2014. And this is part of a larger neoliberal project to treat energy to try to bring the private sector to the use of energy, right? Like we see in the United States with this cap and trade system and carbon credits, right? The idea is to try to find a market-based solution to pollution, right? With, carbon credits and such. So this is similar to that in the sense of you try to bring a private market solution to energy. And so instead of fully privatizing the Federal Electricity Commission, they basically left it there as an empty shell almost, and requiring it to buy from the cheapest producer, right? And these energy auctions of energy, to be rounds of energy auctions. This is what happens now in Spain, right? These energy auctions. The problem is these auctions can be easily manipulated. If you have a basket of energy in a certain round, at least the way it is in the European Union is the most expensive energy source in that round becomes the price that you have to pay for that round, right? So that's why you're seeing energy spiral upwards in countries like Spain, right? The justification for these auctions and that whole system, first of all, a lot of people didn't understand it because it's very complicated, and they didn't even try to explain it. What they were saying is they're going to bring private sector efficiency and green energy. Those were the two major justifications. And the justification was, back in 2013, 2014, Pemex is dilapidated, Pemex is a throwback to the past, Pemex is corrupt. The Federal Electricity Commission as well, right? So these reforms would then bring private sector efficiency and international technology to be able to amp up the green energy production in Mexico. This is the argument. We don't have the money to build wind farms. We don't have the money to do massive solar, right? We don't have the money, we're broke. This is always the argument to try to denude the public sector. We don't have money, we're broke. But these companies can do it, and they want to bring the bounties of green energy to the Mexican consumer. They want to help, right? So it's a potent argument if you've got especially the international press on your side, right? Because it looks glossy in the brochures, right? The wind farms and the panels, and Mexico has to join the 21st century and stop depending on these old creaking 20th century energy monopolies. This was the argument, right? But to open Mexico. And at that time, Peña Nieto was the wonder boy of the international press. He was on the Time cover of Time magazine as Saving Mexico. Remember that cover? I mean, one of the world's worst presidents was just being bolstered and buoyed up by the international press. The Economist had a very glowing cover, right? The Mexican Miracle, right at this time, 2013, 2014, because he was doing exactly what they wanted. And he was using their arguments, right? And then you've got a whole network of think tanks in the United States. I have a whole piece on Jacobin on this, allied to energy interests, like the Baker Institute in Texas, which is allied to Rice University. And that's the heart of US energy interests. So they bring Mexican politicians up there, from the right-wing parties, the worst of the worst in a lot of the cases, and they give them speaking engagements and gigs and foundation money and chairs, and they create, research positions for them, right? And then they funnel these people back into Mexico, and they create a network of, what we should be doing on our side, a network of press and politicians and energy interests, all behind the mask of these, think tanks and nonpartisan institutes, right? The Wilson Center in Washington is another one. Huge energy money in there. It's all energy money. It's all energy money. The Baker Institute is the worst. Check their site. The people they have on there. I mean, it's just, it's despicable. The kind of, networks they're building there. So Peña Nieto was seen as the golden boy for that. And then the problem was, these things are not easy. You need to have you need to have an interest in what's going on, and you have to have a degree of technical knowledge to kind of wrap your head around, because you said it's hard to wrap your head around how these auctions of energy work, and then how it is that the lineup of sources gets made. Remember, the private companies could pretend to have cheaper prices for their energy because they were using public infrastructure. So they didn't have any infrastructure costs. They were using public infrastructure. They were using what was already there. So it was a big, and there were also all kinds of different kinds of incentives for green energy from the federal government. So of course they would look cheaper because you weren't factoring in all the real costs that were there. So they wind up being first in the list, and other things get farther down the list because, the federal government's got to pay for a lot of different things, right? Got to factor a lot of other things into the cost. So that's what happened there. And so when AMLO said, look, all we're doing is nobody has to shut down if you don't want to, but we're feeding the public energy into the public grid first. That's all we're doing, right? And also we're gonna, review the fraud and the abuse in the whole system. Oh, this is the worst thing in the world. Oh my God, no, how can you, no. And so you'd see a lot of these hit pieces, right? AMLO loves coal, AMLO loves dirty energy, AMLO loves this. Whereas actually most of what's going into the grid because of AMLO's reforms is hydroelectric. Now, hydroelectric has problems. There's a problem with dams too. There's a problem with that. But I mean, the difference between hydroelectric and what they said was actually going on is a huge difference. So that's what happened. And I think what really helped make this very clear for people was the blackouts in Texas and the energy crisis in Europe now because of Ukraine. And people have realized that, oh yeah, we really need to have control over our own energy. Oh yes, we do, because you can't depend on the international context. All of a sudden there could be a war, there could be an energy crisis, there could be a pandemic. And then all of a sudden the energy that we imported that used to be cheap isn't cheap anymore, and it isn't there anymore. And I think that's just absolutely made the argument for what AMLO was doing, right? Which is to have national control over your own energy in the context of a very, very fluid international situation.
Well, if there are no further questions, let me give our thanks to Kurt for an informative discussion. I hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I did. And I thank all of you who contributed to the discussion. I also would thank those who could make a donation to help support our work. You can do so by going to our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, which are accessible from our website. I hope you will join us next week when we will bring you a program on social madness with Ron Aronson as he assesses the midterm elections. And finally, let me give thanks to our webinar team, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamond, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, Bessie Bowman, and myself. And now, this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday.